Thank you very much. Welcome. I hope I can stand through. I'm still suffering from a cold. I hope my voice doesn't fail on me soon. So the title is How Can a CIO Secure a Moving Target with Limited Resources? To give you some background, we looked at massive data from our Secunia PS site. This is a freeware tool that scans your PC to identify vulnerable programs. And I looked at the scans of over 4 million users. And this information correlated with information about vulnerabilities led to this title to show how difficult it is to defend and that we really are chasing a moving target. Before we go into this, it's always good to know your enemy when we want to defend. So on the first order approximation, we could map the threat or the changing threat environment on a two-axis model. So we have the attacker's expertise, horizontally from very low expertise to very high expertise, and vertically we have the motivation from just curiosity up to financial gains. So in this easy model we can identify two areas: vandalism, basically unskilled attackers that don't work for money. On the other hand, if financial gain is a major objective, then we see the expertise goes up to the expert. So all range of expertise is involved in this. And what we find is that experts are the authors of the tools that you find in the cybercrime underground. And experts working for money, this is the fastest growing segment. This leads to the situation that tools created by the experts are now available to less skilled attackers, and they are more and more used and abused for financial gain. So if you want to start your cybercrime career, you don't need to be a techie or a geek or any kind of technical background. You just get the tools, formidable tools, as we shall see, and can misuse and abuse them. So this has two implications. We find more and more highly automated attacks. So whether you think you're vulnerable or not, an attack script cannot differentiate. If you have a vulnerability, you will get compromised. And we have more and more opportunistic attacks. And within this landscape, we even have models like malware as a service. One famous example is Turkoyan. I had the pleasure to talk to one of the developers of the Turkoyan RED remote administrative toolkit. It's not a Trojan, it's a remote administrative toolkit last year. This was offered for $250 with a service level agreement and a replacement warranty if this creation is detected by any antivirus within 9 months. So this is now outdated, but you still find those offers. If we want to understand how modern malware can bypass anti-malware, antivirus tools, we have to understand the malware development life cycle. So basically, it can be broken down to 4 simple steps. Step 1 is create the original malware. So you create the malware either by using a construction kit that you find for free or you pay for, or you let it code or you steal it, whatever. In step 1, you create your core malware with some certain malicious functionality. Now, you need one detection signature at this step to detect this malware. Step 2 in the development process is cybercriminals automatically generate thousands or tens of thousands of serial variants or permutations. So those samples all look different, but they retain the core malicious functionality. So right now you need thousands of detection signatures to detect the same breed of malware. Okay, step 3, I'm Swiss, I like this especially. This is quality assurance. So now cybercriminals test all their creations, all those tens of thousands of samples, against all major up-to-date anti-malware tools. If such a creature is detected, it goes back to the permutation phase, step 2, where the parameters are recalibrated. If it is not detected, it goes to step 4, deployment. So rest assured, if somebody is serious about attacking you, the malware they use at the day of attack will not be detected at your perimeter or whatever defense. This is not because they want it, this is because they tested it this way. Okay, with that mass creation of malware samples, we are engaged in an arms race with cybercriminals. they have a much easier play to create the new or an increasing number of new samples than we have to create new signatures or detection capabilities. For example, more than 280 million virus samples were counted in 2010 by Symantec. This breaks down to about 30,000 samples per hour. So good luck with updating all your anti-malware engines. So this is also very effective. Independent tests document that the cybercriminals have between 10 and 45% chance to bypass your antivirus. This also explains why Damballa, company in the US that is specialized in detecting botnets in large enterprises, they found in their assignments that up to 9% of the endpoints to be bot infected. This is in enterprises, they go for large enterprises that can afford and deploy the best of breed in anti-malware, IDS, IPS, whatever. And still they find up to 9% of the endpoints to be bot infected. Okay, so now let's look at it from a criminal's perspective. I think we could easily say that the opportunity for cyber criminals is the number of hosts available in the internet. This is the number of potential targets times the number of vulnerabilities per target. This is the number of points to break in or attack vectors to compromise such a host. Recent data shows that in the internet there are more than 2 billion users with access to the internet. So this is about 30% of the Earth's population. So with around 2 billion endpoints, it is clear that endpoints become more and more targeted by cyber criminals. Further, endpoints are extremely valuable targets. First, by definition, all business critical data is on your endpoint. The most valuable data, you find it on the endpoint where it is found to be the least protected. Whatever business you do, at the end of the day, you work on your endpoint. You don't work in the cellar, in the server rack. So all the data is accessible from your endpoint. This makes them very valuable target for cyber criminals. Then endpoints are very difficult to secure. It's rather easy to secure a server. It has a single purpose. It's a mail server, it's a web server, it's very static. It doesn't surf, it doesn't tweet, it doesn't read emails, and so on. So the endpoints are very difficult to secure because they are dynamic and we have unpredictable usage pattern by the users. So we don't know what kind of ideas or weird steps they do tomorrow. And you only need one single vulnerable program to compromise the entire endpoint. So endpoints are increasingly targeted. And to look at how many vulnerabilities we have on a typical endpoint, I draw on the data we have from our scans. So more than 4 million PSI scans showed us that we have a large diversity in the software portfolios, what is typically installed on endpoints. So to break it down into easy numbers, we find that 50% of the users have more than 66 programs from more than 22 different vendors installed. This is quite a complex environment if you want to protect it. In order to security track this diversity, I build what I call the top 50 portfolio. Say, I look at the representative PC, I say it has the top 50 most prevalent programs installed. This top 50 portfolio has software from 12 vendors, namely 28 Microsoft programs and 22 non-Microsoft programs. Now I can security track this portfolio, and what we found is an alarming trend. So from 2007 to 2011, the number of vulnerabilities, I have a slight scaling error here, the number of vulnerabilities of a typical endpoint with Windows XP and the top 50 portfolio increased from around 200 to over 800, or exactly 870 vulnerabilities in 2011. Or the number of vulnerabilities affecting this endpoint more than doubled in 2 years. And it's a relevant trend because more than 50% of these vulnerabilities provide system access, are highly critical or exploitable from remote. The question is now, what is the origin behind this trend? And what we find is that this typical endpoint in 2011, only 12% of the vulnerabilities are found in the operating system. 10% in the Microsoft programs, and the whopping 78% of the vulnerabilities are found in the third-party programs. Now, if you look at this from a criminal's perspective, this is what you patch. It's easy to patch, you have Microsoft Update. However, cybercriminals just don't care. They will always find enough opportunity to compromise your system by exploiting one of the many unpatched third-party programs. So, what do we need to keep this endpoint up to date? So we need 12 different update mechanisms. We need to master 12 different update mechanisms, as this top 50 portfolio has software from 12 different vendors. Each and every vendor has its own update mechanism. So we have Microsoft Update to patch the OS and the Microsoft programs to fix 22% of the vulnerabilities. And on top of that, we need to master an additional 11 update mechanisms to patch the remaining 78% of the vulnerabilities. We all know that complexity is the worst enemy of security. And we also know that, cybercriminals also know that a patch available does not imply that the patch is installed. And given this complexity, you have to master so many different update mechanisms, this has a measurable effect on the security. When I measure the patch level over 2011 of users of Secunia PSI, on average, 7.2% of the Microsoft programs are found unpatched, whereas 6.5% of the third-party programs are found unpatched. This is a biased population. This is users that have our free tool installed, and this tool automatically can patch software. So in the field, these numbers would even look worse. Further, what we hear very often is that people say, yeah, I have some rare third-party programs, they have a very low market share, nobody cares writing an exploit about it. However, when we correlate exploit availability versus the market share of programs, we find indeed that the bigger the market share, the more likely programs have exploits available, but there's no cutoff. Even programs with a low market share between 10 and 20%, 22% of those have exploits available. So, cybercriminals, they don't need precious zero-day exploits. If they have them, they take them, but they don't need them. They will always find plenty of opportunity in the unpatched third-party programs to compromise the systems. The question now, are we doomed? There are good news. 72% of the patches are available when needed. So in 72% of the vulnerabilities, the patch is available at the first day of vulnerability disclosure. Everybody is still paralyzed by the zero-day exploits. Zero-day exploits are a problem. There's not a lot we can do against it. However, it's not all a force majeure. In 72% of the cases, it's on our table. We can act and we can do something against those threats. And the patch is very, very effective. With a patch, you remediate the root cause of attack. And the patch is better than thousands of signatures. With a patch, you essentially terminate the arms race with cyber criminals. Now, how does this translate into a moving target? It's impossible or very challenging for an organization to patch everything instantly. However, we did a simulation and we looked at, okay, what might be a good patching strategy? Let's say we have a small portfolio for a very small enterprise with 200 programs. Let's take the 200 most prevalent programs. On average, how many programs do you need to patch every year? We look at the last 5 years to get an 80% risk reduction. This 80% risk reduction is the risk due to unpatched vulnerability, weighted by the criticality of the vulnerability. So I compare a static and a dynamic approach. Static approach, every year I patch the n most prevalent programs till I have a risk reduction of 80%. The most prevalent programs, it's static. This represents the case where some year you get some consultants, you define the business critical programs, and every year you concentrate or prioritize in patching only those. The dynamic approach is every year you patch the n most critical programs. What we find is that on average, over the last 5 years, we see here how many programs you patch vertically horizontally, and vertically, how much the risk is reduced. We see that on average, by statically patching the 37 most prevalent programs every year, you get a risk reduction of around 80%. However, if you patch by criticality, you get the same risk reduction by only patching 12 programs. So by patching the 12 most critical programs every year, you get the same risk reduction of 80% as by patching the 37 most prevalent programs every year. Now, why is this so? If we dig deeper, we find that because it's a moving target. Threats are very, very dynamic. So of those 200 programs that we looked at in this sample portfolio, around 50 have vulnerabilities every year. This is the good news. At most 50 have vulnerabilities every year on average. However, of those, on average 39% of the programs that have been vulnerable in 1 year were not vulnerable in the previous or are not vulnerable in the second year, in the following year. So this is the moving target. The threats are very, very dynamic. We have some usual suspects like the browser, the operating system. They have vulnerabilities every year. But on top of that, you have many programs that are vulnerable in 1 year but not in the other. If I go further, now I looked at the portfolio or at the company with 200 programs. If you go up to 5,000 programs, this share increases to up to 62%. So roughly speaking, 50% of the programs that are vulnerable in 1 year are not vulnerable in the next year. What does it mean for you, for your risk assessment? If in 1 year you determine those are the business critical programs, they need to be prioritized and you set up your risk metrics accordingly, this information outdates very, very quickly due to this dynamic threat environment. Okay, any assessment based on patching a static set of business critical programs outdates very, very fast. Okay, to finalize, let's talk about the known unknowns. If you look at your infrastructure from the business perspective or from the criminal's perspective, from the business perspective, this is what we hear very, very often when we talk to our partners or customers. Basically, you have the infrastructure. We have seen roughly 1/5 of your programs are Microsoft programs and 4/5 of the programs are non-Microsoft programs. If you have more and more programs in your portfolio, the Microsoft share will decrease. So you have programs you declare as business critical, then you have programs you know about because you installed them, and then you have programs you don't know about. Even if you don't give administrative rights to your users, if you go to portableapps.com, you find more than 200 programs that everybody can install without admin rights. So this is basically infrastructure, and this is what you patch. Probably the business critical programs, either all of them or most of them, and some of the programs you know about. However, from the criminal's perspective, this is what they attack. So we have a moving target and we need to identify all the programs that we have. A very common business or fallacy that we hear is, yeah, we have program X, this is not business critical, so we won't spend any time patching it. However, from the criminal's perspective, program X, it doesn't need to be business critical. It's just a door opener to compromise the whole system. After compromise of the system, they have access to all business critical information on the host. Okay, to conclude, in case you perceived Microsoft as the primary attack vector, or you identified and patched the business critical programs only, or if you think that rare programs have no exploits, then your defense likely locks the front door while the back door remains wide open. Vulnerability intelligence, knowing where your vulnerabilities are, identifying your programs is very valuable, because then you can dedicate your remediation efforts specifically on where the risk is. As we have seen in this simulation, this saves a lot of resources in the remediation phase. And patching is very, very boring, but given the effectiveness of patches to remediate the root cause of attacks, stopping this arms race with cyber criminals, and given the availability of patches, Patching should also be considered as a primary security measure like antivirus, firewalls, IDS, IPS. So that's from my side. Thank you very much. If you have some more questions, please see me or join me at the booth. Thank you.